Is Europe moving away from US energy and turning to Canada? Some reports claim a big shift is underway. But what's the real story? In today's video, we'll explore whether Europe is truly ditching American LNG in favor of Canadian gas, how the global energy crisis accelerated this debate, and what it all means for geopolitics. For decades, Europe relied heavily on Russian gas. But after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, everything changed. European nations imposed sanctions on Russia, and suddenly they needed new energy partners. The United States stepped in, becoming a top LNG supplier. Now, however, there's talk of Canada stepping up as Europe's potential next big energy partner. This matters because if Europe pivots away from the US, it could shake up global energy markets, impact American exports, and shift major geopolitical alliances. So, is Canada really the next big thing in Europe's energy mix, or is it more complicated than that? Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you more in-depth breakdowns. Thanks, and now let's get into it. First, let's examine how the US became Europe's go-to LNG supplier so quickly. When the European Union imposed sanctions on Russia in response to the Ukraine war, Russian pipeline gas flows to Europe plummeted. According to the International Energy Agency, Russian pipeline exports to the EU dropped by more than 80% in 2022 compared to their peak in 2021. This left Europe in a vulnerable position. It needed reliable alternatives, and it needed them fast. That's where the US stepped in. By 2023, the United States had become the world's largest LNG exporter, shipping a record 91.2 million metric tons of LNG globally. A significant share, around 40%, went straight to Europe. By early 2024, estimates suggested the US was supplying nearly half of Europe's LNG imports. To accommodate these shipments, Europe rapidly expanded its LNG infrastructure, from Germany's floating terminals in Wilhelmshaven to increased capacity in the Netherlands and France. The EU moved swiftly to secure American gas, filling the void left by Russia. But this arrangement hasn't been without challenges. One major issue is price. With tight global markets, American LNG has sometimes been more expensive than European policymakers had hoped. Consumers felt the impact in 2022 when natural gas prices spiked above €300 per megawatt hour at crisis points. Policy uncertainty is another concern. US energy policy can shift dramatically between administrations. While one government may push for fossil fuel expansion, it might also impose tariffs on trading partners. Another might prioritize clean energy while enacting policies, like the Inflation Reduction Act, that some in Europe see as protectionist. This unpredictability makes long-term planning difficult for European energy strategists. Then there's the issue of political leverage. Some European leaders worry about becoming too dependent on the US, remembering how Russia used its energy dominance for political influence. While Washington hasn't weaponized LNG on the same scale, the concern remains. What if a future administration decides to restrict exports or use energy as a bargaining chip in transatlantic disputes? So while the US played a crucial role in stabilizing Europe's energy crisis, many in the EU are already looking ahead, asking, is there a more stable, less complicated long-term partner out there? That's where Canada comes into the conversation. You've probably heard the buzz. Canada is stepping up as Europe's next major LNG supplier. But how much of that is fact, and how much is just speculation? Right now, does Canada export LNG directly to Europe? The short answer, no, not yet. Canada currently lacks operational LNG export terminals on its east coast. Its main LNG project, LNG Canada, is located on the west coast in British Columbia and is primarily geared toward Asian markets. According to official project updates, the first phase is expected to go online around the middle of the decade, but shipments will be headed to Japan, South Korea, and other Pacific Rim nations, not Europe. That said, Canada's potential is massive. Natural Resources Canada estimates the country's proven natural gas reserves at over 2.5 trillion cubic meters. If East Coast infrastructure were developed, such as the proposed Énergie Saguenay project in Quebec, which has faced environmental pushback, or planned expansions in Nova Scotia, Canada could start sending LNG across the Atlantic. The shipping route from Canada's east coast to Western Europe is also shorter than from the US Gulf Coast, which could provide cost advantages if scaled properly. So, what makes Canada a strong energy contender? For one, it has abundant resources. Canada ranks fourth globally in proven natural gas reserves and is also the world's fourth largest oil producer. That kind of resource security is attractive to energy-hungry nations looking for stable suppliers. Then there's trade stability. Unlike the US, which has had its share of trade disputes in recent years, Canada is generally viewed as a reliable partner. European leaders frequently point to Canada's cooperative stance in global agreements, from the Paris Climate Accord to WTO commitments. Canada is also making serious investments in green energy. Hydroelectric power already accounts for about 60% of its electricity generation, and the country is expanding its wind and solar capacity. Looking ahead, Canada has signaled interest in exporting hydrogen, particularly green hydrogen produced from renewables, which aligns with Europe's long-term decarbonization goals. But here's the catch: infrastructure. The main reason Canada isn't shipping large LNG volumes to Europe yet is simply that the facilities don't exist. Building liquefaction terminals and the necessary pipelines is a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar process. Even if projects start soon, it could take until the latter half of this decade, or even longer, before we see Canadian LNG flowing into Europe at scale. Given this context, let's get to the core question. Is Europe actually ditching US LNG for Canadian LNG? The short answer is no, at least not right now. US LNG continues to dominate the European market. In 2023, the United States was the largest LNG supplier to the EU, representing almost 50% of total LNG imports. What's really happening is diversification. While the US remains a major supplier, Europe is actively exploring multiple LNG sources. The EU has signed long-term contracts with Qatar, is in talks with Algeria, and is considering potential expansions from Norway. Canada is in the conversation, but as a future option rather than an immediate replacement. At the same time, Europe's renewable energy boom is accelerating. In 2022, solar and wind combined overtook natural gas in new power generation capacity additions, driven by the REPowerEU plan, which aims to speed up the adoption of green energy. If wind, solar, and hydrogen continue to become more cost-competitive, Europe's reliance on imported fossil fuels could shrink over time. Interestingly, Europe's biggest near-term energy collaboration with Canada isn't LNG at all, it's critical minerals. Canada's critical minerals strategy outlines its ambition to become a leading supplier of key resources like lithium, nickel, and cobalt, which are essential for electric vehicle batteries and clean technologies. This aligns closely with Europe's push for a greener economy. Nuclear energy is another factor reshaping Europe's energy mix. France is strengthening its nuclear fleet, while the UK is constructing new nuclear plants. With nuclear providing a stable energy baseload, the need for imported fossil fuels could further decline. So, if you've heard claims that Canada is replacing US LNG in Europe, take them with a grain of salt. At this stage, actual LNG shipments from Canada to Europe remain minimal, though discussions about future supplies are underway. The bigger picture isn't about one-for-one replacements, but rather Europe's broader strategy to secure multiple energy sources while scaling up renewables. Energy is just one part of a much larger equation. The EU is also looking beyond the US for critical minerals and electric vehicles, and there are several key reasons why. Europe's push for electric vehicles is accelerating. Under an EU mandate, all new cars sold in member states must be zero-emission by 2035. That means a massive ramp-up in EV production, which, in turn, requires a secure and steady supply of battery materials: lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements. This is where Canada comes into play. With vast reserves of these critical minerals, the country is well-positioned to support Europe's EV ambitions. According to Natural Resources Canada, it ranks as the world's sixth largest nickel producer and holds significant, yet underdeveloped, lithium and cobalt deposits. European automakers like Volkswagen, Stellantis, and BMW have already signed or are exploring agreements with Canadian mining firms to secure ethically sourced materials and ensure supply chain stability. It's not that Europe is uninterested in American minerals, but the US has more stringent permitting processes and strong local opposition to new mines. For example, lithium mining projects in Nevada have faced legal challenges over environmental concerns, delaying development. Canada, on the other hand, is viewed as more open to expanding its mining sector, as long as environmental standards are met. Trade tensions between the EU and the US also play a role. The Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, provides generous subsidies for EVs assembled in the US, a policy the EU sees as protectionist, fearing it could push European manufacturers to shift production overseas. In response, some European firms are turning to Canada, which offers its own incentives but doesn't create the same trade frictions with the EU. Just as Europe is diversifying its energy sources, it's applying the same strategy to its EV supply chain. By securing deals with Canada, the EU reduces its dependence on any single supplier, whether that's the US or China, and ensures a more resilient future for its green transition. So, what does this mean for the United States? Will American energy dominance in Europe disappear overnight? Probably not. In the short term, US LNG remains essential for Europe, especially as new suppliers, whether from Canada or elsewhere, are still years away from making a significant impact. However, there are a few long-term challenges on the horizon. One major factor is Canada's potential to ramp up LNG exports. If the country develops a strong export capacity on its east coast, it could directly compete with US Gulf Coast suppliers. According to RBC Capital Markets, Canada could theoretically supply up to 30 million metric tons per year of LNG to the Atlantic market within a decade if proposed projects move forward. That's a substantial volume that could start eating into the US share in Europe. At the same time, Europe's demand for fossil fuels is shrinking. Under the European Green Deal, the EU aims to cut greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 and reach climate neutrality by 2050. As renewables continue to expand, natural gas consumption, whether from the US or Canada, will likely decline over the long term. If the US doesn't pivot toward clean energy exports like green hydrogen, it could find itself with a diminishing market in Europe. This shift also has geopolitical consequences. Energy has historically given the US leverage in transatlantic relations, but if Europe secures multiple suppliers or significantly reduces its fossil fuel dependence, Washington's influence over EU energy security will weaken. While military and financial ties will remain strong, losing the energy card could limit US diplomatic clout, particularly in negotiations over trade or defense spending. Another area of competition is the EV supply chain. As Europe strengthens its partnerships with Canada on critical minerals, US producers could find themselves sidelined, especially if American mining projects continue to face slow permitting processes and local opposition. Without policy adjustments, the US risks missing out on becoming a key supplier of EV battery components. The US isn't on the verge of losing its entire European market tomorrow, but these trends suggest that staying competitive will require adaptability. Investing in cleaner energy technologies, maintaining stable trade relationships, and keeping LNG pricing competitive could be crucial for Washington to remain a major player in the evolving global energy landscape. So, where does that leave us? Europe isn't ditching US LNG overnight, but the push for diversification is clear. Will Canada become a key LNG supplier for Europe, or will renewables make fossil fuel imports less relevant? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you found this breakdown insightful, hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into global energy and geopolitics. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.